of how, of a story from my own life about how something gets split off or marginalized and then pops up in the form of a projection. So when I was a kid growing up, there were 5 of us. We were very close together, and we were also extremely competitive. And my father was, he was a good athlete and won awards and was All-American in both football and basketball, you know, as a teenager. And he had this really strong convention around humility. Like, it was one of the most important things that my father believed, is that you, regardless of your success, that you had to be humble. And that was a constant message that he gave to us. And it was really interesting when I first learned about projection, because I was at Naropa and I was a student, and there was a person in one of my classes who was just irritating me. And he was irritating me because he was so arrogant and kind of a know-it-all, and would stand up and sort of hold forth and all that. When I checked in with my friends, because we're always building coalitions of people who agree about our point of view, and you know, so I was basically checking it out with other people, making sure that, you know, they were seeing things the way I was. And people may have seen something, but it wasn't provoking them the way it was provoking me. And it was the first time that I realized that we could have a similar perception, but what's important is that there's an emotional charge there. You can almost always locate a projection because for whatever reason you're disturbed. And this becomes a really important point, because there are so many things in the world that we don't like, that we would prefer to be different, that we actually feel we have to act to change. But those things that create a really negative response in us, or a really positive response in us, most likely are carrying some of our shadow material. There's some way in which a split-off part of who we are is getting projected out, and that's what it is that causes the emotional disturbance. The other thing that's important is that it takes energy, actually, to keep people in that position, or to keep those qualities in that position. If I can't identify with my arrogance, and the only thing that I allow in my consciousness is some kind of humility, the part of me that does feel good about myself, or that is arrogant or thinks I'm superior, I have to use my energy to keep that in second and in third person. And the only way to recapture that energy is to recapture the projection, is to be willing to take what's it, to move it into second person and then move it into first person. And that's really what the 3-2-1 process is all about. So let me give you another example that comes from my work. For lots of years I was a mediator, and I worked on racial and ethnic fairness issues and race bias, and also just race relations, which means that I did lots of dialogues and lots of interactions and lots of facilitated meetings around issues of race. And it was one of the places where I saw this phenomenon most clearly, because people would come to these meetings, and it doesn't matter what ethnicity, it doesn't matter what country of origin, what nationality, what gender you are, there would be this range of consciousness around the issue of racism. And for some people to be able to look into that I may have some kind of race bias, that I may have bias against people who aren't my own ethnicity or my own culture, is so shameful and so distasteful and so basically unacceptable that it has become shadow. It's absolutely not identified with. And when it's not identified with, it can't be worked with. And you never can really become free or transcend these kinds of biases if you can't identify with them to begin with. And I saw it really, really clearly. The people who'd been able to identify with it, who could sit in the pain of that, the discomfort, who could feel you know, just the shame of those qualities, actually were able to move beyond them in a way that people who could never identify with those in the first place couldn't do. And in my view, it was a really good example of what's shadow, because other people were racist, and other cultures were racist, and institutions were racist, but I wasn't. And I want to change those qualities out there, but I'm not able to really identify in a healthy way in order that I can then disidentify and move on and work on the issues in a way that actually has an effect. And in my conversations and our conversations with Ken, he talks a lot about stage development and how even though we're moving through stages, you can move through the material, rational stage and become very pluralistic and multicultural and sensitive and really interested in holding everyone's subjectivity. But interestingly enough, that part of you that was capitalistic yourself and what's the word? Individualistic and opportunistic is split off. And so you haven't been able to actually fully integrate that into your sensitivity. So even though you want to include everybody, the one group of people that you don't want to include are the businessmen and the scientists, because they're too objective and too cold and too opportunistic. So it's a very important phenomenon, and one that that's what we're interested in exploring. And the last point that I want to make about it is that traditional meditative spiritual practice will not get at this. And the reason that it tends not to get at it is because just sitting on the meditation cushion, emptying your mind, following the breath, and if a negative thought arises, cutting that thought and returning to the breath, what's missing is the ability to identify with whatever that material is. It has to be identified with first. So people will ask the question, how can my spiritual teacher be homophobic? Well, there's a really easy answer. It's because identifying and really sitting in the place where you feel the experience of being homophobic, or you feel the experience of being gay, or you work with that whole dynamic in yourself and you sit in it and you own it, isn't generally part of what we do in spiritual practice. Instead, we release that and we go back to the breath, and we don't relate with those structures and those aspects of our personality. The problem is that then you have a gay student and you haven't dealt with that particular issue, and all of a sudden you find yourself wanting them not to be explicit about their sexual orientation, or wanting them to be, suddenly you're asking them to be, closeted. How does that happen? Well, it happens for that very reason. Questions? Yeah, Paul.
I was wondering, at the risk of exposing my own shadow, how do you define health? You talked about healthy development before.
Healthy development is the ability to take any aspect of who you are, to sit with it in first person as a subject, to feel the sensations that go along with that, the discomfort, maybe the pain, the disorganization, the chaos that comes from that, and you sit with it long enough that then you actually can start to see it as something to be observed and looked at and contemplated. The emotional charge relaxes. It becomes something objective that can be reflected on. And when that happens, then you start to disentangle from it. Then you can actually move on. So we call it healthy disidentification, as opposed to unhealthy dissociation, which is what I was describing earlier. Does that make sense?
Partially, yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering why you label that process healthy, though. I mean, why?
Partly why it's healthy is you're not using your energy to keep it unconscious anymore. So your energy's freed up. There aren't parts of who you are that are marginalized and cut off. And as long as, you're basically an energetic system. And if you're keeping parts of yourself out of your awareness and you're using your energy to do that, it's not free to help you move in your development.
I'm experiencing a real charge around this whole issue.
Around the whole issue? Yeah, well, go ahead. I think it could be interesting.
The whole concept of health bothers me. I don't know why.
Yeah, like there's health and there's not health.
Just the value judgment of that is healthy and that is not healthy. I always experience it as, who are you to say that? Or why is that healthy? Why do you define it as healthy?
Yeah. Well, let's look at a disease process for a moment. Okay, so let's imagine that somebody has developed gangrene, and there's an infection developing in their foot. From one perspective, there's no value judgment on that. It's a process, and from the perspective of big mind, that's what's happening, and there's not necessarily a good or a bad about that. We might even say karmically, we don't know what the import is of that. But from a relative perspective, you could say that you don't want the person to lose their leg, and you certainly would like their energy to be freed up rather than treating the disease to make art or to engage with their spouse or to enjoy the day. So I think you're right in the sense that there's no absolute healthy, unhealthy.
Right, okay.
It's within ever-present awareness, it's all the same. But from a relative point of view, you might prefer to have your energy to do other things.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I guess that's where my issue is, yeah.
Yeah, okay.